"Don't open that box alone, Mr. Greer," the crew leader said, his voice dropping low. "And whatever you do, don't tell your son we found it." I had just pulled into the gas station on Route 9 when Ray called me. I could hear the sound of his guys going quiet in the background, the kind of silence that falls over a work site when something goes wrong. Ray Kowalczyk had been doing property cleanouts in Mercer County for 20 years. He was not the type of man who called the client in the middle of a job unless something serious had come up. I asked him what he meant. He told me to just come to the farm. He told me to come alone. Then the line went dead. I had hired Ray 3 weeks ago to clear out my late wife's family farmhouse on Cartwright Road, a 2-story white clapboard house sitting on 40 acres of field and timber in rural Ohio. Dorothy had grown up in that house. Her father built it in 1951, and it had passed to her when her mother died. We had spent almost every summer there for 30 years of our marriage, planting a garden, fixing the porch, watching our son Derek run through the fields as a boy. After Dorothy passed 9 months ago from a sudden cardiac event, I had held onto the property, not ready to let it go. But the bills were stacking up, and Derek had been pushing hard to sell. He had opinions about the listing price, opinions about the timing, opinions about which realtor to use. He had a lot of opinions for a man who had not set foot on that property in 4 years. So I had hired Ray quietly, told myself I just wanted the place cleared and cleaned before I made any final decisions. I put the truck in drive and headed out to Cartwright Road. When I arrived, Ray was standing at the edge of the gravel driveway, his arms crossed over his chest, his hat in his hands. He was a stocky man in his early 50s, with a face that spent too much time in the wind. He walked to my window before I even had the engine off. "Appreciate you coming quick," he said. "What did you find?" He did not answer right away. He glanced back at the house, then at me. "You know the root cellar under the back porch? The old one Dorothy's dad put in, with the wooden plank floor?" I nodded. I knew it. Dorothy used to store canning jars down there every fall. We pulled the planks up to check for rot before we haul anything out. One of my guys found a section of the subfloor that didn't match the rest. New wood, dry as paper, nailed in different from the others. He rubbed the back of his neck. "There's a metal box down there. Fireproof, military surplus style, padlocked. It's got a note taped to the lid. The note has your name on it." I stared at him. "Walter," he said quietly. "The note is in Dorothy's handwriting. I spent the drive out there thinking about my wife. Dorothy Greer had been a high school science teacher for 32 years. She was methodical and deliberate. She did not do things without a reason. When Dorothy left a note, she meant it to be found. And when Dorothy hid something, she meant it to stay hidden until the right moment. The fact that the right moment had apparently arrived made my stomach drop. Ray led me around the side of the house to the back porch. The cellar door was propped open. I followed him down the narrow wooden steps into the cool, dim space. One of his workers, a young man named Dion, was standing off to the side with his hands in his pockets. He pointed a flashlight at the floor. The box was about the size of a shoebox, olive green, with black metal latches. It sat in a shallow cavity that had been fitted neatly under the replaced section of subfloor. The note taped to the lid was folded once, written on the cream stationery Dorothy had used for as long as I could remember. I crouched down. My knees ached in the damp air. I reached out and picked up the note first. My hands were steadier than I expected. It read, "Walter, if you are reading this, I am gone, and I could not find another way to tell you what I know. Open this alone. Do not let Derek near it. I am so sorry. My love, I am sorry I waited this long." I sat back on my heels and looked at the box for a long time. Ray sent Dion upstairs. Then he sat down on the bottom step and gave me the room. The padlock had a combination dial, not a key. I did not need to think long. Dorothy and I had a number we used for everything, born out of a private joke from our first apartment in 1979. The month and year we adopted our old beagle, the dog we had for 14 years. 6, 7, 9. I turned the dial. The lock clicked open. Inside was a voice recorder, small and black, the kind teachers used to dictate notes, and underneath it, a manila envelope sealed with tape, with my name written across the front in blue ink. I pressed play on the recorder. Dorothy's voice filled the root cellar, and I had to grip the edge of the box to keep from falling over. She sounded tired. She sounded like she had been carrying something for a long time. Walter, I do not know when you will find this. I hope it is before something happens that cannot be undone. I need you to listen carefully, and I need you to believe me, because what I am about to tell you will be very hard to hear. She paused. I could hear her breathe. Derek has been stealing from us. Not borrowing, not making mistakes, stealing. I found out 14 months ago when I noticed a discrepancy in our joint savings account, the kind of discrepancy you do not notice if you are not the one who checks the statements. I checked the statements. I have always checked the statements. I pressed stop. I needed a moment. Ray looked at me from the step. He did not say anything. Good man. I pressed play again. He has been making withdrawals using a power of attorney document I never signed. I had our attorney, Margaret Holloway. Look at it. She confirmed. The signature is not mine. Walter. I do not know who helped him do it, but the document has been used 11 times in the past 2 years to pull money from the savings account and from the certificate of deposit we set up for our retirement. The total is close to $60,000. I put the recorder down on my knee. $60,000. That was 4 years of careful saving, the money Dorothy and I had set aside after I retired from the electrical union at 62. The money we planned to live on. There is more, she continued when I pressed play again. He took a loan against this property, Walter, against my family's farm. He used the same forged power of attorney to put a lien on the land. The lender is not a bank. I looked up the company. It is registered in a strip mall in Columbus, and it has 2 other properties in foreclosure tied to it. If Derek defaults on this loan, they come for the farm. They could take it. My jaw was tight enough to crack a molar. I had worked 30 years in commercial and residential electrical work. I had bid jobs, managed contracts, hired and fired crews. I understood paper. I understood what a lien meant. I confronted him, Dorothy said. 2 months before I found this spot, I called him and I told him what I knew. He cried, Walter. He told me he had gambling debts, that he was in trouble, that he would fix it. He begged me not to tell you. He said it would break the family apart. And I made a mistake, Walter. I believed he would fix it. And then I started getting dizzy. I started feeling confused in the mornings. I know what happens when someone adds to a prescription without the patient knowing. I turned off the recorder. I sat in that root cellar for 2 full minutes without moving, with Ray Kowalczyk watching me from the step, and with the silence of that old farmhouse pressing down on both of us. Then I opened the manila envelope. Inside was a paper trail that Dorothy had assembled with the precision of a woman who had graded lab reports for 3 decades. Bank statements with highlighted withdrawals, a photocopy of the forged power of attorney, a printout of the lien filed against the property, with the name of the lender circled in red, a screenshot of a pharmacy website she had flagged, showing a compound sold under a supplement label that she had written 2 words next to, in her small, careful handwriting. Sedative properties. And at the bottom of the envelope, a photograph. It was a still image, printed from what appeared to be security camera footage. It showed the interior of a pharmacy counter. Standing at the register, her back partially turned, was my daughter-in-law Stacy. I put everything back in the box. I stood up. I looked at Ray. I need a favor, I said. Ray nodded slowly. Whatever you need, Mr. Greer. Don't tell anyone you found this. Not today, not tomorrow, not until I figure out what I'm dealing with. He stood up, took his hat from his head, and held it against his chest. Mrs. Greer was a good woman, he said. She helped my nephew when he was failing chemistry. Sat with him for 2 hours after school 3 days in a row and didn't take a dime. I owe her. He held out his hand. You have my word. I drove home with the box on the passenger seat like a passenger of its own. The house felt different when I walked in. It had felt different for 9 months. Too quiet, too full of things that used to mean something, and now just occupied space. But now it felt dangerous in a way that made me look at my own kitchen differently. I looked at the tea kettle on the stove. I looked at the prescription bottles lined up on the counter, the ones the doctor had adjusted twice in the last year because my blood pressure kept coming in erratic. I looked at the reading chair where I fell asleep almost every evening now, earlier and earlier, deeper and deeper, while Stacy sat across the room with her phone. Stacy and Derek lived 20 minutes away. She came by twice a week, always with something. Dinner in a container, a smoothie she had made, a cup of herbal tea she poured from a travel thermos she always brought herself, saying she had stopped drinking the store brand because of the additives. I went to the cabinet and took out every supplement and vitamin bottle I could find. I did not touch the prescription bottles, those were from my doctor, and I had watched the pharmacy fill them myself. But the supplements and the herbal packets and the loose tea, Stacy had brought me in a little cloth bag last month. I put every one of them into a paper bag and set them on the counter. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with Dorothy's envelope, and I read every page 3 times. By the time the sun went down, I had 2 things clear in my mind. The first was that my son had stolen from us, forged my wife's name, and mortgaged her family's land to cover gambling debts that were still unpaid. The second was that my daughter-in-law had very likely been drugging me for months to keep me slow and compliant, and she had done the same to Dorothy before that. I called Margaret Holloway's office from the landline. She was Dorothy's attorney and mine for estate work. I had her personal cell number from when we updated the wills 3 years ago. She answered on the 3rd ring. I told her I had found something. I told her I needed to come in first thing in the morning. She asked me if I was safe where I was. I looked around my kitchen. I said I would be. That night, I did not take the supplements. I did not drink any tea. I ate a sandwich I made myself from a can of tuna, and I sat in Dorothy's reading chair with the box on the side table, and I talked to my wife the way you talk to someone when the room is quiet enough to hear them back. I told her I was sorry I had not seen it sooner. I told her she had been the smartest person I knew for 50 years, and I had never once doubted it, and I was not going to start now. I slept better than I had in months. Margaret Holloway's office was on the 2nd floor of a federal-style building on Main Street in town, with old oak floors and a window that looked out over the courthouse square. She was a small woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the habit of pressing her lips together when she was thinking through a problem. She had been practicing law in this county for 35 years. She read everything Dorothy had left me without saying a word. When she was done, she took off her glasses and set them on the table. "This is not a civil matter anymore," she said. "I know. The forged power of attorney is fraud. The unauthorized withdrawals are theft. The lien on the property is fraud as well. And if the company holding it has other foreclosure actions tied to it, there may be a broader criminal lending scheme involved." She folded her hands. "And the photograph of your daughter-in-law at a pharmacy counter, combined with what Dorothy wrote about the supplements and your own symptoms, that opens the door to a criminal poisoning investigation." I looked at my hands on the table, the hands of a 67-year-old man who had pulled wire through conduit in freezing warehouses and baking summer attics for 30 years. Good, honest hands. "How do I make sure it sticks?" I asked. "How do I make sure they don't just hire a lawyer who says Dorothy was confused and the signature mistakes were clerical errors?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We need them to expose themselves. We need them to act in front of witnesses who will testify to what they saw and heard." She looked at me carefully. "Derek has been pressuring you to sign over the farm for sale, correct? Every week, for the last 2 months. Does he know you hired Ray's crew to clean it out?" "No. I didn't tell him. He thinks I'm still deciding." She nodded slowly. "Then he does not know you found the box." She picked up a pen. "Walter, I think we give him one more meeting. We let him believe you are finally ready to sign the property over. We let him come to you, at the farm, with whatever documents he wants you to put your name on. And when he arrives, we are ready." "Ready how?" She set the pen down. "I have a contact with the county sheriff's white-collar unit. I worked with him on an estate fraud case 4 years ago. If I call him today, he can have a plainclothes team in place by tomorrow afternoon. And I have a colleague in Columbus who specializes in financial crime. She can have a forensic audit started on the bank records before the week is out." She looked at me steadily. "But you have to be willing to walk back into that situation and let it play out in front of witnesses. You have to let them believe they are winning right up until the moment they are not." I thought about Dorothy hiding a metal box under the floor of her father's root cellar. I thought about her recording her own voice into a small black recorder and sealing it in an envelope with my name on it. Doing it alone. Doing it quietly. Doing it while her body was failing and she was frightened because she knew I would need to hear it from her directly. If she could do that, I could do this. Call your contact, I said. Let's set the stage. I called Derek that evening from my cell phone. I made my voice sound the way it had sounded for the past few months, tired and a little uncertain, the voice of a man who had been sleeping too deeply and waking up foggy. It was not hard to imitate. It was what I had actually sounded like before I stopped drinking the tea. I told him I had been thinking. I told him he was right that the farm was too much to manage. I told him I was ready to let it go and I wanted to do the paperwork at the property because it felt right to say goodbye to the place properly. Derek's voice changed immediately. The impatience he usually kept barely hidden went quiet, replaced by the smooth, warm tone he used when he wanted something and sensed he was about to get it. He said he would bring the deed transfer documents and the listing agreement. He said he would bring Stacy because she had some paperwork of her own for me to look at, related to the estate account. He said he would have their lawyer present to make sure everything was handled correctly. I said that sounded fine. I said I would see them at the farmhouse at 2 p.m. After I hung up, I sat very still for a long time. Then I called Ray Kowalczyk and asked him to be there early. The morning of the meeting, I drove out to the farm before dawn. Margaret had sent 2 men from the sheriff's office ahead, a detective named Burns and his partner, and they had spent an hour the afternoon before walking through the house and the root cellar, reviewing Dorothy's documents, and setting up a small audio recording system in the front parlor, where I planned to have the conversation. It was a modest room with a fireplace and 2 armchairs and a settee that had belonged to Dorothy's grandmother. It smelled of old wood and dried lavender. It was, in its own way, the perfect room for the last chapter of a story that had started in this house decades ago. Ray arrived at 7. He walked through the parlor and checked every corner with the quiet competence of a man who knew buildings the way I knew circuits. "I'll be in the kitchen," he said. "If it goes sideways, you know where to find me." Margaret arrived at noon. She sat with me in the parlor and went over what she needed me to do and what she needed me not to do. She needed me to stay calm. She needed me to let them lay out what they planned to have me sign. She needed me to let Derek speak long enough for the recording to capture his intent clearly. "Don't confront them early," she said. "Let them feel safe. Let them believe they are in control. And if Stacy brings something for me to drink," Margaret looked at me. "Don't drink it." They arrived at 2:15. Derek's truck came up the gravel drive too fast, kicking up a spray of small stones against the fence post. He was wearing a sport coat, which he never did. He was trying to look official. Stacy was in the passenger seat, and behind them, a second car pulled in their attorney, a man I did not recognize, carrying another portfolio. I was standing on the porch when they got out. I leaned on the railing and let my shoulders drop. I made myself look like what they expected. Derek walked up with his arms slightly open, the way you approach someone fragile. "Hey, Dad, you doing okay?" "Tired," I said. "Come on inside." We went into the parlor. I sat in Dorothy's armchair by the fireplace. Derek sat across from me on the settee, his attorney beside him setting papers out on the coffee table. Stacy sat nearest to the door, her tote bag on her lap, watching me with eyes that were calculating in a way she probably thought was affectionate. "We really think this is the right move, Dad," Derek said, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. "The farm has been sitting empty. It's a lot for you to carry. The listing price we talked about it would set you up for a long time. You could get a nice place in town, closer to everything, easier to manage." I nodded slowly. I looked at the papers on the table. The attorney, who introduced himself as Graham, pushed a document toward me. "This is the deed transfer, Mr. Greer. Once you sign this, the property transfers to Derek and Stacy jointly, and they've agreed to place it with the listing agent within 60 days. The net proceeds, after settling the outstanding lien on the property, would come to you." I looked up. "What lien?" Graham glanced at Derek. Derek's jaw tightened by a fraction. "There's a small business loan, Dad. Your son took out against the property a couple of years back," Graham said smoothly. "It's being paid down, but the balance will come out of the proceeds at closing. It's all disclosed in the documents here. $60,000, I thought. That was not a small business loan. That was a theft repaid with my own land. I reached forward and picked up the pen. Stacy leaned over and unzipped her tote bag. She pulled out a thermos and a paper cup. You look pale, Walter. Let me get you some water before you sign. You should stay hydrated. She smiled at me, a smile that did not reach the corners of her eyes. I set the pen down. I looked at Stacy. I looked at the thermos. I looked at my son. Derek was watching the pen, not me. Actually, I said, my voice steady, before I sign anything, I want to ask you something. Derek looked up. Sure, Dad. What is it? I want to know what was in the supplement Stacy's been bringing me. The room went completely still. Derek blinked. What? The herbal tea. The smoothies. The vitamins in the green bottle she left here last month. I kept my voice level, almost gentle. The way you speak when you are not angry anymore because you have moved past anger into something quieter and more final. I want to know what was in them. Stacy stood up from her chair. Walter, I don't know what you're talking about. I was trying to help you. You've been struggling since Dorothy. I know what you were doing, I said. Derek got to his feet. Dad, you sound confused. This is exactly what we've been worried about. Margaret said you were having trouble keeping facts straight and Margaret did not say that, I said. Margaret Holloway is in the kitchen right now. Derek's face went from confident to blank in the time it takes a circuit breaker to trip. I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and pulled out the voice recorder. I set it on the coffee table between us. Your mother left this for me, I said. She recorded it 14 months ago. She hid it under the root cellar floor in a fireproof box, quote. She knew what you had done. She knew about the forged signature and the $60,000 and the lien on her family's land. I put my hand flat on the recorder. She also knew about the supplements. Derek stared at the recorder as if it might detonate. She was a science teacher, I said quietly. She spent 32 years teaching young people to observe carefully, to document their findings, and to trust the evidence in front of them. She did not stop being a scientist just because she was sick. She kept notes, Derek. She kept very careful notes. Graham, the attorney, had already begun edging toward the door. Don't, Margaret Holloway said from the hallway. She stepped into the parlor doorway, and beside her came Detective Burns in plain clothes, his badge on a chain around his neck, and his partner behind him. Derek spun around. His face cycled through 3 expressions in quick succession: confusion, calculation, and then a raw, ugly fear. He looked at me with eyes I did not fully recognize on the face of my child. You set us up, he said. Your mother set this up, I told him. I just followed her instructions. Stacy moved for the door. Burns's partner was faster. He put himself in the frame and held up his badge. Ma'am, I need you to stay in the room. Stacy stopped. She held the thermos against her chest like something she could not afford to let go of. And then Detective Burns said very quietly, I'm going to need to take that from you. She let it go. What followed was not dramatic in the way you imagine from television. There was no screaming, no running. Derek sat back down on the settee and put his face in his hands. Stacy stood very still, looking at a point on the wall somewhere between the window and the fireplace, as if she was calculating distances. Graham had the careful, neutral expression of a man who was already rehearsing how he would explain to the Bar Association that he had not known. Burns walked Derek through the rights he had. Derek did not respond. He just sat there with his hands over his face. I looked at my son, and I felt something I did not expect. Not triumph, not even relief, just a deep, bone-level grief, the kind that settles into you when you have known something terrible for long enough that the knowing has become part of you. I had lost Dorothy. I had lost the man I thought Derek was. I was sitting in the farmhouse where my wife had grown up and where we had planted a garden together 30 times over, and the future I had imagined for this place was gone. But the land was still here. The weeks that followed were the hardest kind of work, not physical, but the paperwork and phone calls and depositions that take more out of a man than any job site. Margaret coordinated with the county and the state. The forensic audit of the bank accounts turned up not just the $60,000 in withdrawals, but an additional $32,000 transferred to an offshore account in Derek and Stacy's names. The lien on the property was voided by a county judge within 10 days, on the grounds of fraud and forged documentation. The supplements were analyzed. The results came back with a compound that Detective Burns described to me with a careful, practiced blankness, as consistent with deliberate sedation over a prolonged period. Not enough to kill outright, but enough to dull a person, to keep them slow and suggestible, to make the signature on a document feel like the easier path. Dorothy's symptoms in her last months were reviewed by a specialist Margaret retained. The specialist could not make a definitive determination about cause and effect. The cardiac event could have occurred independently. But the documented history of the supplements, the compounding of her existing conditions, the timeline of her deterioration, it was all submitted as part of the record. Stacy's attorney argued against the poisoning charges with the aggression of someone who knows the case is close. Margaret believed the prosecution would pursue it at the state level. I let the lawyers do their work. Derek pleaded guilty to fraud, theft, and forgery on the recommendation of his public defender, who told him the evidence left no reasonable path to trial. He was sentenced to 4 years in a state facility. He looked at me once during the sentencing. I held his gaze for as long as I could, because I was still his father, and because I believed in at least that much. Stacy's case was still working through the court when I made my decision about the farm. I did not sell it. I drove out to Cartwright Road on a Tuesday in April, 3 months after the sentencing, when the fields were starting to green up and the apple trees along the fence line were just coming into blossom. I walked the full perimeter of the property the way Dorothy's father used to do every spring. 40 acres takes about an hour on foot if you do not hurry, and I did not hurry. I thought about what Dorothy had wanted for this land. She had talked, in the years before she got sick, about doing something with it. She had friends who ran a 4-H program out of a rented space in town, always short on room. She had talked about a garden plot, something productive, something that gave young people a reason to get their hands dirty. I called Ray Kowalczyk that evening. He came out to the farm the following Saturday with his nephew, a 23-year-old named Marcus, who was studying agriculture at the State University Extension program. We walked the property together, the 3 of us, and I told them what I had in mind. I was not going to sell. I was going to convert the south pasture into a working educational garden, partnering with the county 4-H program and the local vocational school. The farmhouse would be maintained as a gathering space. The cost would come from the retirement funds that the court had ordered, clawed back, and returned to me. Marcus asked me what the place would be called. I looked out at the fields, at the apple trees, at the old white house Dorothy's father had built in 1951, and which Dorothy had grown up in, and which she had loved enough to hide a box under its floor, so that it would not be taken from the family without a fight. The Dorothy Greer farm, I said. That's what it'll be called. Ray nodded. Sounds right, he said. Marcus was already taking notes on his phone. Before I left that evening, I walked back to the root cellar one last time. The floor planks were all back in place, the cavity empty now, the box in Margaret's fireproof office storage. I knelt down and put my hand on the wood where it had been. I told Dorothy about the garden. I told her about Marcus and the 4-H kids who were going to learn to grow things in her south pasture. I told her I was going to fix the east fence and repaint the porch and put in a proper gravel path from the gate. I told her she had been right about everything, and that it had cost us more than it should have, and that I was sorry it took so long, and that the land was still ours. Then I stood up, and I climbed the cellar stairs into the evening air, and I drove home through the fields turning gold in the long April light. People like to say blood is thicker than water. I used to believe that. I raised my son with that belief, gave him every advantage I could build with my own hands, and expected it to mean something when the years started to add up. What I learned is that loyalty cannot be inherited. It can only be earned, and it can be lost, and the people who earn it are not always the ones who share your name. Dorothy knew that. She built her insurance policy out of a metal box and a voice recorder and 32 years of careful observation, and she left it where she knew I would eventually find it, in the floor of her father's house, waiting for me to be ready. If this story reached you somewhere real, I hope you will consider what it means to pay attention to the people who have always paid attention to you. Leave a comment below. Have you ever had someone prove their loyalty to you when it mattered most? I would like to know. And if you have not subscribed to Crimson Revenge yet, there is a button right below this video, and every story we tell is built on exactly this kind of truth.